Welcome to Faith Seeking Understanding Online. I'm Roland, and we're busy making our way through a module on biblical theology. If you're watching this lesson the week that it comes out and you have any questions about what we're going to talk about, then you can head over to our lesson page and submit a question there. We'll be collecting these questions throughout the week and putting them together in a Q&A video that will come out next Monday. In this module, we're looking at the way in which God works through his people to make his presence known. These plans culminate in Jesus, who opens up a way to a new creation that is free of sin, suffering, and death. We're approaching all of this through the lens of 5 key figures in the biblical story. In the first week, we looked at the originals. Last week, we looked at the patriarch, and this week, we're going to be looking at the mediator. Now, the word mediator can mean different things to different people, so it's worth clarifying what we mean when we're talking about it in this lesson. When you hear the word today, you might instinctively think of a negotiator, someone who helps two parties compromise enough so that they can reach a middle ground. Now, this isn't the kind of mediator that we're going to be looking at in this lesson. The sort of mediator that we're interested in is a mediator between God and man, who helps God establish a covenant with sinful humans without compromising his holiness. This mediator is the means through which God makes himself accessible to the world despite the sinfulness of humanity. Now, if that job description makes you think of Jesus, then you're not wrong. But in order to understand him in context, we need to start with a figure that comes earlier in the biblical story. Now, without a doubt, the gold standard for mediators before Jesus was Moses. Deuteronomy closes with these words summarizing his significance. It says, "There has not arisen a prophet since in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. None like him for all the signs and the wonders that the Lord sent him to do in the land of Egypt, and for all the mighty power and all the great deeds of terror that Moses did in the sight of all Israel." From the first time he stepped into Pharaoh's chambers to the moment he died overlooking the Promised Land, Moses played a crucial part in enacting and sustaining the covenant that God wanted to make with Israel. He began his job as mediator right at the beginning, when he called Pharaoh to let God's people go from slavery in Egypt. He was the spokesman for God before each of the plagues. God did miracles through him, and once the people escaped Egypt, he was the person through whom God commanded them and provided for them. When Israel came to Mount Sinai, Moses was the middleman between God and Israel as he laid out the covenant for them. God never spoke directly with Israel, but did all things through Moses. And as you read through Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, you realize that mediating this relationship between God and his people could not have been an easy task. On more than one occasion, the people of Israel almost completely rejected God, first by creating and worshipping a golden calf idol, and later by refusing to trust God to give them the land that he had promised, despite all the mighty deeds that he had done in front of them since taking them out of Egypt. In both cases, their rejection was so serious that God threatened to destroy Israel and start over with just Moses and his descendants. And in both cases, Moses interceded on behalf of the people and appealed to God for mercy. In other words, if it weren't for his mediation, our Old Testaments would be the story of the nation of Moses rather than the story of the nation of Israel. Now, of course, Israel sinned much more than just in these two incidents. In fact, they sinned so often that at one point, Moses cried out to God about the burden of leading these people. He asked God, "Why have you dealt ill with your servant? And why have I not found favor in your sight, that you lay the burden of all this people on me? Did I conceive all this people? Did I give them birth, that you should say to me, 'Carry them in your bosom,' as a nurse carries a nursing child to the land that you swore to give to their fathers? I am not able to carry all this people alone. The burden is too heavy for me." Now, this burden for Moses existed because he was the mediator of a complicated relationship that exists when a holy God tries to live among sinful people. But it's precisely because this relationship is so complicated that mediators were needed in the first place. Notice I say mediators, plural, and that's because Moses wasn't the only mediator of the covenant with Israel. He was the first and most important mediator, but if he were all they were, then the covenant wouldn't have lasted very long after he died. A holy God living with sinful people is just not a stable situation. And so unless you have constant mediation, it's not going to last. As I see it, after Moses, it was up to the prophets and the priests to continue mediating the covenant. Very roughly, we could say that the prophets were God's representatives to his people, while the priests were his people's representatives to God. Together, the prophets and the priests filled this mediator-shaped hole that was left after Moses died. Now, while I think it's natural for us to think of Moses as a prophet, I suspect we may find it a bit more difficult to think of him as a priest. After all, Aaron was the first high priest of Israel, and he was around at the same time as Moses. But I think it can be helpful to think of Moses as a kind of proto-high priest, the priest before the priests, who set the precedent for them to follow, just like he did for the prophets that came after him. To motivate this a little before we get into the details, note that every high priest is anointed by and given the garments by the previous high priest, and that the first high priest, Aaron, was anointed by and given the garments by Moses. In other words, in order to get the priesthood going in the first place, Moses needed to act like a high priest for them. And in other ways, as we'll see, the role Moses played for Israel anticipated the formal role that the priests would play going forward. Now, because of time constraints, and because I think people will be more familiar with prophets than with priests, the mediators that we're going to be focusing on in this lesson are the priests, with only an occasional mention of the prophets as we go along. The priesthood in Israel is called the Levitical priesthood, because all the priests, or their helpers, come from the tribe of Levi. The main function of the Levitical priesthood was to maintain the holy zone that God had created in the world when he started living within the nation of Israel. The problem, as we've said, is that God is holy and humans are sinful, and holiness destroys sinfulness. So, with God living among Israel, there was this delicate balance that needed to be maintained in order to ensure that God could stick around without destroying his people. And it was the job of the priests to maintain this delicate balance. To start thinking about how the priests mediated this relationship, it's worth reflecting on the layout of the original Israelite camp in the wilderness. We can think of the camp as being broken down into these logical concentric layers of holiness, with the most holy things being at the center of the layout and the least holy things being on the outskirts. Since God is what makes things holy, the inner chamber of the tabernacle where he dwells is at the center of this layout and is called the most holy place, or the Holy of Holies. Moving outward, we have the outer chamber of the tabernacle, called the holy place, or often just referred to as the tent of meeting. Moving outward again, we have the court of the tabernacle and the camps of the Levites, which we've said includes the priests as well as those who serve the priests in their daily duties. Outside of these camps, there are the camps of the other tribes of Israel, and finally, on the outskirts of the Israelite camp is the place where specific kinds of unclean people would have to live, so as not to spread their uncleanness throughout the camp. The reason these distinctions needed to be made was because if something unclean ever came into contact with something holy, the unclean thing would be destroyed. And since normal life is full of different sorts of uncleannesses, whether it be due to unintentional sins or due to some ritual impurity, delineating the camp into these sections meant that the Israelites didn't have to constantly be in fear of dying. They only had to be careful when moving inward from their lair as they approached God at the tabernacle. This brings us to the first task of the priests as covenant mediators. In order to worship God at the tabernacle or bring him offerings, the people needed to move inward towards the tabernacle, and it was the priest's job to teach the people of Israel how to distinguish between the holy and the common, and between the clean and the unclean. In fact, very early on, 2 of Aaron's sons died because they inappropriately approached God at the tabernacle, which prompted God to articulate this responsibility of the priests. He says in Leviticus 10, "And the Lord spoke to Aaron, saying, You are to distinguish between the holy and the common, and between the unclean and the clean. And you are to teach the people of Israel all the statutes that the Lord has spoken to them by Moses." We unpack these categories in our lesson on sanctification in our first module, so we're not going to go into all the details here. We're just going to give a brief overview for the sake of understanding the priesthood. Something becomes holy by being set apart for God in some way, and everything that's left behind by this process is called common. Israel is holy relative to the other nations, and within Israel, the priests are holy relative to the common people. Clean and unclean, on the other hand, have to do with our individual condition, or our purity. The basic purity laws that apply to anyone are given in Leviticus 11-15 and 18-20. There are 2 sets of laws because they serve different purposes. And if you're a priest or play some other role in Israelite society, then additional laws will also apply to you. Thankfully, all of these details aren't really important to us here. What is important is the relationship between the holy and the common on the one hand, and the clean and the unclean on the other hand. If you're common, then you can be clean or unclean without any problem. But if you want to approach something holy or become holy yourself, then you need to become clean first. If an unclean thing touches a holy thing, then it profanes it or defiles it, and in most cases, this results in someone dying. Thus, priests had to teach the people of Israel about these categories so that they knew when they could safely move from a more common place, like the outer areas of the camp, to a more holy place, like the courts of the tabernacle. The second responsibility of the priests was to facilitate all the offerings that the people brought to God. Every offering was performed by a priest on behalf of the offerer, and never directly by the offerer themselves. This means that priests played an integral role in the relationship that existed between God and humans in the Levitical system. Now, we don't always appreciate how important priests were because of this, so consider the fellowship offering as a worked example. In these offerings, the best part of the meat was burnt on the altar for God, and the other parts were divided between the priest who was facilitating the offering and the offerer themselves to eat. So in a fellowship offering, the priest is effectively facilitating a meal between God and the offerer. J. Sklar explains the significance of this as follows. He says, Israelites often confirmed a covenant relationship by sharing a meal with other covenant partners. The fellowship offering functioned as a type of meal, serving as a celebration of the covenant relationship and a rededication to covenant responsibilities. Now, you can only come to the tabernacle and make these sorts of offerings if you're clean. So the third responsibility of the priests was to make it possible for unclean people to become clean again through a process called atonement. Typically, if someone was unclean, they would wait some predetermined amount of time, and then they would come to the tabernacle to make offerings for atonement. These would involve some combination of the sin offering, the guilt offering, and the burnt offering, which the priest would facilitate and thereby make atonement for the person. In extreme cases, the priest might actually have to go outside the camp to the person rather than the person coming to the tabernacle, and the priest would make atonement for them out there with similar forms of offerings. But even though there's this difference between coming in and going out, the same general principles of atonement through offerings applies. Once people had been atoned, they were free to make other offerings to celebrate their communion that they now had with God. This is atonement on the individual level, but once a year the high priest would also make atonement for the whole nation of Israel on a day called the Day of Atonement. This is the only day of the year when anyone could go into the most holy place, and even then, the high priest had to be extremely careful in how he did this. Before he went in, he had to make atonement for himself, and then even when he did go in, he had to throw up what you could imagine as a sort of smoke screen, so that he would prevent himself looking upon God. On the Day of Atonement, the high priest atoned for the collective uncleannesses of the people of Israel, so that God could continue living among them and make himself available to them as well as the nations around them. The fourth responsibility of priests was to make regular offerings to God on behalf of the people, without the people necessarily bringing anything themselves. For example, in Leviticus 24 we read, "Every Sabbath day, Aaron shall arrange the bread of the tabernacle before the Lord regularly. It is from the people of Israel as a covenant forever." And fifth, the priests and the other Levites were to keep guard of the tabernacle to prevent anyone from touching it or entering it, at which point that person would probably die anyway. So as mediators, the priests were following part of the precedent that was set by Moses. As Moses had brought Israel to God at Mount Sinai, so the priests enabled them to approach God at the tabernacle. As Moses pleaded for God's mercy, so the priests made atonement for the people. As Moses spoke to God in the original tent of meeting, so the priests ministered at the tent of meeting. And as Moses taught Israel how to live with God, so the priests taught Israel to separate the unclean from the holy, so that they might continue to live with God. As long as the priests did their job as covenant mediators, Israel and the nations around them would have access to God and experience the blessings that God had promised to Abraham. As God says in Numbers, "Speak to Aaron and his sons, saying, Thus you shall bless the people of Israel. You shall say to them, The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. So shall they put my name upon the people of Israel, and I will bless them." Now, before we take a look at how all of this develops, it's worth looking back at the priests of God that came before Israel. Perhaps the most enigmatic priest before the time of Israel was Melchizedek. He first shows up briefly, seemingly out of nowhere in the story of Genesis. In the story, Abraham had just saved his nephew Lot from a group of kings that had attacked him. And while meeting up with one of his allies, we see Melchizedek mentioned for the first and last time in Genesis. It says the following: "And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High. And he blessed Abram and said, Blessed be Abram by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And Abram gave him 1/10 of everything he had." Just as with the Levitical priests in Israel, here we see Melchizedek bless Abraham and Abraham pay him a tithe. Now, despite this being the only time we encounter Melchizedek, for some reason, he's highly esteemed by David in Psalm 110. You'll likely have heard the beginning of the psalm before. It starts with, "The Lord says to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool." And then a few verses later, he says the following: "The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever, after the order of Melchizedek." Now, why would David mention Melchizedek here if he's only around for 2 verses in Genesis? The author of Hebrews argues that Melchizedek is important because he is the priest to Abraham. And since Abraham is the father of all Israel, Melchizedek was therefore in some sense the priest to all of Israel, including the Levitical priests themselves. Thus, Melchizedek's priesthood must have been better than the Levitical priesthood in some sense. We'll return to Hebrews shortly, but for now we mention Melchizedek as an interesting precursor to God's priests in Israel. And depending on who you ask, there's even a precursor to this precursor. Even though Melchizedek comes pretty early on in the biblical story, some scholars have suggested that Adam and Eve were truly the first priests that we see in the story. On this proposal, the Garden of Eden is understood as a better version of the temple that we find in Israel, a version that granted direct access to God. But we might wonder, if we have direct access to God, why would we need priests? Part of the answer comes when we look at the reason that God placed humans in the garden in the first place. In Genesis 2, it says the following: "The Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work and keep it." Now, the idea of keeping is very broad, but when it's applied to a particular thing, it usually involves both taking care of that thing and preventing any outside interference. For example, a shepherd keeps their flock, and the priests were told to keep guard or keep charge of the tabernacle. Now, working and keeping a garden would of course involve some gardening, but when that garden is also the holy place where God lives, then we can start to see why Adam and Eve might also be called priests. If this is right, then part of keeping the garden would have involved keeping out anything unclean that might have interfered with its holiness. And this is precisely what Adam and Eve failed to do. They listened to the serpent and made themselves unclean, leading to the exclusion from the garden that they were meant to keep. In other words, they failed as priests, and in doing so, doomed all of humanity to a life without God. And this is why we needed the Levitical priesthood in the first place, to restore something of what Adam and Eve had lost back in the fall. This is also why such a delicate balance existed and needed to be maintained by the Levitical priests, because of the tension that now exists between God's holiness and human sinfulness. Unfortunately, as we know from the rest of the biblical story, the priests of Israel followed the example of Adam and Eve and failed to be the mediators that Israel, and really the whole world, needed. Consider God's indictment of them through the prophet Ezekiel. He says, "Israel's priests have done violence to my law and profaned my holy things. They have made no distinction between the holy and the common, neither have they taught the difference between the unclean and the clean. And they have disregarded my Sabbaths, so that I am profaned among them." This is a very serious situation. The priests were supposed to teach the people, but they didn't. They were supposed to make regular offerings on the Sabbath, but they didn't. They were supposed to keep the temple from being profaned, but they didn't. Without its mediators, the Levitical system was bound to fall apart at some time. And that's exactly what happened in Ezekiel's day, when God left the temple and sent Israel into exile among the nations. Now, Israel eventually did return from exile and rebuild the temple, but God never returned with them. They had been sent out into exile because of their sin, and they never really ever repented from it. And so he never returned to live among them like he had before. When he did eventually return, It wasn't as some unapproachable presence hidden in the inner chamber of the temple, but as the man Jesus, who walked freely among the uncleanness of his people. When Israel died on the cross, Matthew, Mark, and Luke tell us that the curtain in the temple, which separated the Holy of Holies from the outside world, was torn in two, which clearly indicates the ending of an old era and the dawn of a new era. With Jesus, God established the new covenant he had promised earlier through the prophets, a covenant that wouldn't be subject to the same weaknesses as the old covenant that he'd made with Israel. And with the introduction of a new covenant comes the need for a new mediator, a new Moses, to mediate between God and humanity. Now, out of the whole New Testament, the most explicit discussion of Jesus as the mediator of the new covenant comes in the book of Hebrews, which opens by contrasting Jesus to the prophets who had come before. It says, "Long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets, but in these last days he has spoken to us by his Son." The author was of course aware that there were prophets around in the early church after Jesus' ascension. The prophets he's referring to here are those whom God chose to progressively reveal his plans to his people. And because Jesus is the culmination of those plans, he's also the capstone of God's revelation of those plans. Thus, while Moses may have been the first and paradigm prophet for Israel, Jesus was the final and greatest prophet of all. The author doesn't mention Moses explicitly in these opening verses, but he does get to that a few chapters later and argues that Jesus is greater than Moses, just as a son is more important in his father's household than a faithful servant. Now, if Jesus is greater than Moses, and Moses was in some sense both a prophet and a priest, then we should expect that Jesus is not only the greatest prophet, but also the greatest priest. And sure enough, the book of Hebrews dedicates a large chunk of its remaining time to arguing that Jesus is the great high priest of the new covenant. If you've read through Hebrews before, you might have been a little confused when you saw the author turn to spend so much time unpacking the priesthood of Jesus. But having looked a bit now at the role of priests as covenant mediators, I think we can begin to see why this is such an important topic for him to cover. We've said that priests are responsible for maintaining the covenant set up by an initial mediator, by maintaining the balance between God's holiness and his people's sinfulness. Priests are representatives of humanity to God, approaching him on their behalf to make offerings and atonement for them. Now, when it comes to thinking about how all of this works itself out in the new covenant, it's best to think of it as a fulfillment of the Levitical system in the old covenant. Not fulfillment in the sense of doing something that was promised, but a fulfillment in the sense of establishing a more perfect or more fully filled out version of what had come before. In a way, we can appreciate that there's both continuity and discontinuity that exists between the Levitical priesthood of the old covenant and Jesus' priesthood in the new covenant. We still have a priesthood, it's just better than the priesthood that was around before. The best way to see this is to look at how different aspects of the old covenant and the new covenant compare to one another. First, in the old covenant, the priests ministered in an earthly temple built according to the pattern shown by God. In the new covenant, Jesus has ascended to God the Father himself and ministers in the heavenly temple that the pattern was originally based on. Second, in the old covenant, the temple itself needed to be cleansed with offerings because it could get tainted by being near the uncleannesses of humanity. This is actually what the sin and the guilt offerings were for in the Levitical system. In the new covenant, by contrast, the temple where Jesus ministers doesn't ever get tainted. Third, in the old covenant, the high priest could only approach God in the Holy of Holies once a year on behalf of the people. But in the new covenant, Jesus is always at the right hand of God, constantly interceding on our behalf. Fourth, in the Old Covenant, offerings and sacrifices had to be given repeatedly, every day, every week, and every year, because they never truly removed sin from the offers that brought them. By contrast, in the New Covenant, Jesus has offered himself as a perfect sacrifice on our behalf, once for all to bring about true atonement and forgiveness of sins. And fifth, in the Old Covenant, the responsibility of the high priest was passed on from generation to generation, as the previous high priest died. In the New Covenant, our high priest has risen from the dead and ascended to heaven, never to die again. This last point actually brings us back to that enigmatic figure of Melchizedek that we saw earlier. Recall that he showed up for a few verses in Genesis, where he blessed Abraham, and then again in the Psalm by David, where David says the following: "The Lord has sworn that he will not change his mind. You are a priest forever, after the order of Melchizedek." In the Old Covenant, all the priests were of the order of Aaron. which required them to be Levites descended from the first high priest, Aaron. But Jesus is neither a Levite nor a descendant of Aaron, so it raises the question about what order of priest that he belongs to in order for him to be the great high priest of the new covenant. The author of Hebrews picks up on what David says in the psalm to explain that Jesus was a priest in the order of Melchizedek. Melchizedek belongs to no genealogy and has no genealogy of his own, so descendancy doesn't really seem to be an important thing to be part of his order. Rather, the psalm states that the way someone enters the order of Melchizedek is by being a priest forever. Unlike the Levitical priests who die, the Melchizedekan priests are everlasting. Thus, the author of Hebrews says that Jesus is a priest in the likeness of Melchizedek, not on the basis of a legal requirement concerning bodily descent, but by the power of an indestructible life. This provides yet another reason for thinking that Jesus' priesthood is greater than that of the Old Testament. As we saw earlier, the order of Melchizedek ministered to Abraham himself, and is therefore the priesthood to Abraham and his descendants, including the Levitical priests. So these are 6 ways in which the New Covenant provides a fully filled out version of the priesthood that we saw in the Old Covenant. 6 ways in which we now have a better mediator, and therefore a closer relationship to God. An important implication of this is that we don't need to fear that our mediator will fail like the old mediators did. They failed by succumbing to sin, but our mediator Jesus defeated sin on the cross and now sits with God in heaven, constantly interceding on our behalf. Because of this, we have a confidence in our relationship with God that was impossible before, and this confidence in Jesus should spur us on to the end as we wait for the day when he returns. As the author of Hebrews says, "Therefore, brothers and sisters, since we have confidence to enter the holy places by the blood of Jesus, and since we have a great high priest over the house of God, let us draw near with a true heart in full assurance of faith, with our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience, and our bodies washed with pure water. Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. And let us consider how to stir one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, all the more as you see the day drawing near." So that's it for our lesson on the Mediator. If you have any questions and you're watching this the week that I came out, like I said at the beginning, you can head over to our lesson page on our website, where you can there'll be a way for you to submit the question there. We'll be collecting those through the week and putting together a Q&A video where we try and answer as many of those as we can. And that Q&A video will come out next Monday. If you're watching this in the future, then that Q&A video is already out, so you can head over to our lesson page and see if we answered your question in it. If you'd like to get updates about future talks, then you can subscribe to us on YouTube, or you can follow us on Twitter or Facebook. All the links will be in the description. Thanks for joining.